In the vast majority of these cases, there was actually stress stuck on the child's nervous system before the environmental toxins could even show up and wreak their havoc. So to fully, foundationally get your child to heal with autism, to go to the root of their development and the real deep root cause of their condition, you've got to get into the autonomic and central nervous system.
Welcome to the Experience Miracles podcast, where we help parents find hope, answers, and drug-free help to overcome your child's chronic health challenges. I'm your host, Dr. Tony Ebel, and I'll be sharing my experiences as both a dad and a doctor on every episode. I can take the latest science and neurology of healing and break it down in the most simple and relatable way possible. We'll take on the toughest topics and answer your biggest questions through interviews with other amazing parents and leading experts, leaving you with practical action steps that you can take to help your child heal and thrive. It's time to expect and experience miracles. Let's get started.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Experience Miracles podcast. This one is for you, moms, dads. This one is for you, other professionals and practitioners who are maybe jamming with us on this podcast. We are talking about a topic, a condition, autism, and we're going deep into this conversation and this condition and a direction and to a depth that I promise you very few, if anyone else, has taken you to before with autism, and we need to. I really, I'll share out of the gates here. So autism was the condition that I first started studying. And when I say studying, I don't mean kind of just perusing and listening to what others are saying about autism. I mean, I read every study about genetics and every study about maternal distress and fertility and birth trauma and antibiotics and all the things you're going to learn today. And I went right on to every board and every organization and every conference and every seminar and every expert I could go to learn about autism. It's actually the first condition I really committed my career to serving and helping. So I really do not like discussing myself personally. I like getting most into the science and the action steps that gets your kiddo healing and recovering and restoring and onto a better track. But I just need to give you the relatability to let you know that this is an area of expertise for me, because I really have opened up the hood and not just studied this from a science and academic perspective, but most importantly, moms, and most importantly, parents, I have spent the last 16 years sitting knee to knee with you again and again and again, and listening intently and entirely to your child's story so that we could find the clues, find the triggers, find the patterns, and find the real root causes to autism. And we did find them. We have found them, and we do know them. So when you get online and you see that the CDC and Forbes and everybody else under the sun says, hey, new study came out, autism is 1 in 36, and they just present this just negative outcome. And that's what I'm kind of alluding to there. I have a love, frustration kind of relationship with my job in this perfect storm autism expertise spot, because what I'm about to teach you, I wish I didn't need to. Obviously, for all of these cases, when our kiddos are struggling, when they get sick, when they get a diagnosis, especially if it's a big one like this, and by the way, today's conversation, we're not going to break down necessarily the different levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. We're just going to talk about autism in its entirety. But when you get that diagnosis and then you get to work, which is what autism parents I have found do bigger, better, more consistently than anything else, you end up having to look backwards to go forward, right? And that's this episode. That's the perfect storm. We have to go backwards. We have to find the root causes and the triggers and really identify them so that we can address them. And so that's my case history with this. And I always like to joke, choosing this title for this episode, Deep Dive into Autism, really what it means, really what we're doing is we're doing a deep dive into the root causes, because they're multifactorial, of autism. And then if there's a subtitle, including talking about the one that no one else does. Now, let me hit that deeper for a second. When I say no one else does, I'm not just contrasting the conversation we're about to have with the one that you don't get to have in the pediatrician or the traditional neurologist office, because they don't break down. They don't go after the root cause. People ask us all the time after they finish hearing what I'm about to explain, how come my doctor meaning traditional pediatrician or medical team, how come they didn't tell me about this? How come they don't know about this? How come they don't talk about this? Because they don't look for root cause. Once they have kind of assembled the symptoms, given it a diagnosis, they're done. That's the end of their clinical protocol road. And especially with autism, some kids with autism, because it leads to challenges with hyperactivity and OCD and other sort of things, there is kind of these off-label uses of medication. But really in the traditional medical world, they're not even going to get close to the depth of this conversation because they just don't ask those questions. So if you don't ask the questions and listen to the moms and actually read the real research, you're not going to get to the answers. But I'm actually still contrasting this conversation during the intro here to what you may have thought coming into this episode was the root cause or root causes of autism. My $1,000 bet for sure is that 90% plus of you listening to this podcast and looking to help your child with autism heal and get to their fullest potential. And I hope you're still going for full recovery, because why the heck wouldn't you? Because kids are designed to be plastic, resilient, and have the capacity to heal. And the earlier you start and the more of the root causes you can address, which is exactly what we're doing here on this podcast, is getting into the foundational one that you may be missing. Well, a lot of those recoveries and a lot of those healing potentials have happened. They're real. And so we've studied those, we know those, and we're going for those. So in that world, it's very likely that you've gone to absolute depths with natural health, nutritional health, diet changes, detoxes, gut, microbiome, getting mold out of the house, getting toxins out of the house, adding, lavender, magnesium, you name it, chelation, detoxification, hyperbaric oxygenation. If you're in the autism world, one toe, all of a sudden you're full body in, and it can be overwhelming for parents helping a child with an overwhelmed nervous system and autism diagnosis. And so with this conversation, when I say dive deep, I mean deeper than even they do in the natural, functional, integrative world, to this real foundational root cause conversation. And so I was kind of joking with the team before we set to record this one. I'm like, who do I think I am that in an hour or less, I can do a deep dive into autism? Maybe we should, kind of call this part one of it, because when I first started getting into this work, I actually was traveling back and forth a lot to San Diego. And so from Chicago O'Hare to San Diego, it was about a 4-hour flight dead on. And I'm a little bit chatty, which is, why I probably should have had a podcast long ago, because I love talking about this stuff. And I'll talk to anyone and everyone about these kind of like hidden in plain sight secrets that we've found with autism and chronic illness in kids. So the old airplane conversation, right? When somebody asks, hey, you going home? You going to work? I'm going out to teach at a conference, whatever. I was always more than willing to enter the conversation in what I do. And so anytime autism would come up, every one of us, whether we have a child with autism or not, at those numbers we have, all of us are affected, probably at least at most one family member away, right? A niece, a nephew, a cousin, whatever it may be, a close friend, or multiple is likely the answer. So we all want to know the answer to that question. What causes it? Well, I used to joke, well, this 4-hour flight to San Diego might just give me enough time to go into all the causes of autism, and it really wouldn't. This is actually a 100-hour conversation to really do the fullest deep dive into autism. So what we've chosen to do is to talk about the science, the research, and the real life clinical findings. And when I say that, now the science, I love it. I'm a PubMed nerd. I literally have my favorite studies printed off, highlighted, ready to discuss with you and bring to you in a real life, understandable, actionable manner. I love the science. I love the textbooks. I love the research articles. But I love most being in practice and working knee to knee in partnership with you, moms and dads. And the vast majority of the answers I found to what's causing autism and what we need to do to help a child heal naturally and neurologically, they were found by listening and doing what we call CSI, chiropractic science investigation with you, moms and dads. So it was really found through case histories and something called pattern analysis or pattern recognition, which is something you actually become really good at when you are a chiropractor, because we always like to joke that DC stands for Doctor of Cause. So once I opened this hood, and real quick, my story on this, my child, I do not have a child diagnosed with autism, you maybe, if you go up a few episodes, you'll hear about Oliver's story, his birth trauma, and all the challenges he was supposed to go through. He was headed down this road, but everything we're talking about, he got to cheat. His dad was a pediatric chiropractor who had spent 3 years studying birth trauma, vagus nerve, dysautonomia, all the things you're going to learn here. So the healing mechanisms we're going to talk about were applied in his life right away. So we got ahead of his storm. But I actually found these answers through practice-based working with moms and dads, and then studying the research. And I think that's where a lot of the disconnect to your doctors may lie. Traditional doctors maybe have thinking they've gone into research, but they haven't gone to the depths of it if they didn't have moms lead them there. Now, what I mean by that is your questions often spark our questions, which then leads us to go find the answers in science. And goodness, we absolutely have. So my journey may have started academically, scientifically, and I'll bring that to life here big time. But the whole point was to bring it to life. I always make a joke during our Perfect Storm workshop. Whoever said the phrase, the common quote, knowledge is power, not that knowledgeable of a person. Because to play on that, it's knowledge in action. It's the application of knowledge that creates the impact and creates that power. So that's what we're going to do with this episode. So buckle up, Buttercup. We're going to dive into every crucial conversation and element of this autism topic, and we'll get really, really deep. And I promise you this too, on future episodes, we're going to bring other experts. We're going to take, I'm introducing about 5 to 7 main talking points with this episode, and then we will bring in experts and we'll take each individual thing, like the gut and microbiome, like gross motor challenges, like the vagus nerve, a bunch of these things I'm about to introduce to you. We'll do deeper dives on the individual elements and causative factors, or what we'll kind of call in today's episode, the triggers of autism, and we'll go even deeper. But I'll get you down the road that I know no one else has yet with this episode. So please listen all the way through, because you're going to find some answers that other people just haven't gotten to you yet. So first off, let's go to what everyone else says and just talk it down for a minute or two. So when you get online, you get into the traditional media. So let's just call it how it is. Traditional medicine and traditional media, pretty much the same thing for this last couple of generations, right? What you hear in the doctor's office is what you see on the news, and it's all the same, and the news is in charge of selling stuff for the doctor's office and so on and so forth. It's just real, okay? And so when they talk about autism, the one thing they've updated in their articles, so I, getting ready for this podcast, doing my episode, just wanted to have the latest information. I went online again and I said, okay, well, let's see what the traditional media folks, traditional doctor folks, AAP, CDC, so forth, what are they saying about autism today as of this recording? Same thing they've been saying the last couple of years. Now, if I actually go back 15 years when I began my study into autism, autism was still just 1 in 1,500. So back then, you couldn't find a lot of people talking about it. You couldn't find a lot of research. It sounds insane to say that because of our awareness and our understanding of what's going on has risen, grown so much in that time. But that's just the reality of my career arc, if you will. And so back then, 100% of people purely labeled it genetic. Nobody in the traditional world back then, 15 years ago, even about 10 years ago, would even entertain the conversation about environmental, so lifestyle influences on autism. Thankfully, awesomely, that has changed dramatically. On our side of the fence and in our world, we've always been focused on root cause and the environmental triggers. We know there's genetic predisposition. We know that there's a lot of things that have a genetic predisposition. But I want you to hear these words. They're nerdy, but they're very clear to understand. And it's so important for families with autism. There is a difference, significant difference between the words genetic predisposition and genetic predetermination. Now, I may or may not, my undergrad degree was in genetics and molecular biology, just to give you a little bit of a hint into how nerdy I really am. At Iowa State University, go Cyclones. Iowa was actually the Cyclone State. The Hawkeyes, yeah, they struggled. That I'd have to really talk slower for those folks on this episode. So love you, but you'll be all right. So, little joke in the middle of that sucker there. Can't not do it, So the truth is, when we look at this genetic predisposition, it is exactly that. Some families, due to different things that moms have, and you can actually still unearth it from pure genetics. Genetic disorders are things that have chromosomal deletions. They are things like Down syndrome. They are those trisomy 18. There is true genetic disorders, and then there is genetic predisposition. Now, I actually don't even want to spend the whole podcast episode on this, but I want you to look into something, and I promise another episode on this down the road, called epigenetics. E-P-I, and then the word genetics. Now, that would be my current area of expertise, and epigenetics tells us this. We are massively able to influence our genetic outcome. So how our genes are actually going to play out and determine our neurophysiological function, so therefore health, based upon the environment we put ourselves in. Now carry that one layer deeper. That is most important in what's called the sensitive and critical periods of development for our kiddos. Those are words you're going to hear a lot on this podcast. These sensitive, critical developmental windows. So if the environment is massively stressful, massively toxic, early during these sensitive and critical developmental windows, when our genetic code, its baseline is there, but its activation and blueprint is not determined at all. It's very pliable. So the analogy I always give folks is, it's not that your child, if you've ever played cards, so here's a little Iowa background again, right? If you've ever played any card game, right? 52 cards, 4 suits, clubs, hearts, and so forth in there. What the traditional medical system would like us to believe is that our health and our kids' health, that hand of cards, its exact code is predetermined, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you believe that to be true, which science has disproven massively, if you believe that to be true, well, then there's nothing you can do about your health other than rely on outside-in influences, right? So that theory, that genetic determinism theory for autism and many other conditions, it's a super great theory for them to continue to stick with today. And for the most part, they have. But for the most part, the one little glimmer of hope in that traditional world, and by the way, I know a lot of times it sounds like I'm bashing versus contrasting on this, but I'm really trying to just compare your options and contrast these conversations and give you the answer, which I know you're going to ask, which is, why didn't my conventional traditional pediatrician tell me this? Because they're in a system that doesn't use the right lens to even look directly in front of them where the problem is and where the answers have been, which is pregnancy, labor delivery, early childhood exposure to antibiotics and toxins, and the stuff we're going to get into here. But I do have this glimmer of hope in the current traditional world. They're finally starting to say in their research papers and in the articles online, we now think it's a combination of genetic influence and environmental problems. Now, do they ever open the hood and go far at all into the environmental conversation and the lifestyle component? Not in the traditional world. So let's go from there all the way into that conversation. What does that mean? So we know it's not just simply genetic, and we know that autism isn't a singular factor. Now, what it is what we call the perfect storm. It's a sequence or series of stressors that a child's central nervous system and whole biological, physiological system is exposed to early and often, that accumulates. That's why we call it the perfect storm, or other people who have done this research and do this work talk about toxic load. That early and often an excessive exposure to all forms of stress. So not just toxins, but also emotional stress and physical stress, as we'll break down next, in the most sensitive critical periods. So early in life, from conception to in utero embryonic development to brand new babies, labor, delivery, the first weeks, months, years of life. These are the crucial sensitive periods of neurodevelopment. And when they are thrown off track by stress, by the perfect storm, the earlier and the more it's thrown off track, the more significantly or severely, if you will, the more that's going to send a child down the road of an autism diagnosis. And if we just speak to them for a second, the more severe, the more often, the more of it they went through, the more early, the more likely they're going to go to level 2. Level 3, autism with significant disabilities and day-to-day challenges that we want to address with our natural health options and care protocols, okay? So think of it as not a singular factor. It is a multifactorial condition, and that's important to know. But the most important thing to talk about is what few practitioners, even on the natural functional integrative side, go. It's the sequence or the order with which the body got out of balance that we really need to figure out, because the order in which your child got sick is the order in which we need to help them heal. Let me say that one more time. The order with which they went down this road of autism, perfect storm, and neurophysiological dysfunction is the order with which we need to get them to heal. So what we find in today's world is most families awesomely, rightfully, are barking up the right tree by working on their gut, working on their child's microbiome, working on their child's motor tone, PT, OT, speech, working on their child's endocrine and metabolic function, working on their immune system and trying to get them out of this inflammatory cascade they seem stuck in, chronically sick, chronically inflamed all the time. Those are all the right moves in the right direction, but I want to teach you on this episode, they might be out of order. You might be missing step 1. And honestly, my favorite way to teach this is actually not even the missing link. Often with autism, you'll see an image of a puzzle, right? And especially when those organizations that will actually address this conversation and talk about healing and helping a child heal. And it's not about the diagnosis. By the way, you'll never hear me say the word cure except to tell you this. We're not going after that. This is not about treating. This is not about curing autism. This is about addressing the root cause neurophysiological imbalance and dysfunctions that add up and stack up to a diagnosis of autism. So we don't treat, we don't cure autism at all. We take care of each single kid, personalized, individualized, custom tailored to what their neurophysiological dysfunctions, which we can find in their case history and find in the examination, tells us is going on with them. And we address that naturally and completely. And just like the bad stuff stacks up, adds up to bad stuff, the good stuff done in totality, because if it's multifactorial, we likely have to do a multitude of things to get a child with autism better. But I really need you to hear me on this one, parents. We need to do them in the right order. It's called the neurological hierarchy of development, or the neurological sequence or sequelae of development. And if that's how it was supposed to go online and get a healthy, perfectly functioning brain and nervous system, if it was designed by God to go in a specific order, we need to operate clinically in that order to get your child better. And I got to tell you, that's why I kind of probably already 3 times over said the same thing intentionally there. That's what I find missing in families. That's what I find when I work with other practitioners who are looking to address and help a child with autism heal. They're doing the right things, but often there's 2 big challenges. They are missing the foundational thing, almost kind of step 0 versus even step 1. And then they are doing things all at once, all kind of mashed and meshed together instead of in a specific sequence or batting order. And if I can get you to see that as one of our 3 key take-home points today, we will really be able to help your child in a major way. And when you get that information, mom and dad and practitioners, it doesn't just help your child, but it helps you make sense of why you might be feeling, my goodness, we're doing everything. I'm in this group and this blog, and I went to this conference and I saw this doctor and we got these labs and we did this thing and we saw this expert and we're doing all the things and this thing over here, there's got research and science and it makes sense and it should be good and it should be working. And this thing over here, we've got research and we've got science and we've got an expert and it makes sense. And I see on their website, they've helped other kids. And I saw in this mom group that they went gluten-free, casein-free and cleaned up their diet and that kid got better. This kid did OT and got better. You live in this world of overwhelm with autism, because there's so many options. Now, this is the conversation I wouldn't have even known to have with you 15 years ago because there wasn't so much awareness about all these different elements. There wasn't so much practitioners and options and care out there about all these things. So this is a good part of the conversation, but to get you maximum results and to get your child optimal full potential outcomes, we need to cut through that conversation and get rid of your overwhelm and allow you to go, aha, what if it's that? What if it's just that? What if I'm doing all the right things, but maybe doing them all jammed together? And that old adage of too much of a good thing is actually overwhelming my child who's already overwhelmed. And as you're about to learn, stuck in what's called sympathetic fight or flight overdrive. Okay. So when we look at it this way, the last thing I kind of just got to, and it's, I put it in my notes and I always took it back out of my notes because I was like, this is such an incomplete kind of theory out there that it's like, do I even want to address it? But, a lot of people are saying, okay, well, the reason it's 1 in 36 is it's always been around. There's no environmental factors. It's purely genetic, and we're just screening for it earlier and better and diagnosing it more often. To go from 1 in, actually not that long ago, it was like 1 in 3,500 and then 1 in 1,500 and 1 in, I'm not a mathematician, but the scale, the percentage growth of, meaning the percentage of kids in the population today struggling with autism, which is, especially level 2, level 3, which is where a lot of these kids are, that's not really hidden in plain sight. When a child's struggling with autism and they're stimming and they're nonverbal and they have some of the real deep extra troubles that can go with a level 3 diagnosis of autism, you don't just miss that. You don't just miss that on a pediatrician exam. You don't just miss that in a classroom. So to say that it's simply at those numbers because we're diagnosing it better, that's one of the worst excuses. When you're a kiddo, like you literally watch your child lie, or like punch their sibling, like you visually saw it. And then you go, Elena, you can't do that to Tiny. And she goes, I didn't do that. And you're like, I saw you do it. And then the more that a child like kind of commits to a story, and untruth, lie is a hard word here for this analogy, but the more they commit to that, the more they like dig in, right, and stick with it. Man, is that happening in the autism world. When you talk to, supposed medical experts about autism, they just can't unhook themselves from what they've been saying for so long to see the forest through the trees, to see that the perfect storm and the environmental triggers and answers are right before us. They have been. We know them. We understand them. We got to address them in the right sequence. What is the perfect storm? Now, there's multiple episodes on this, including the first foundational episode. And when we talk about the different ingredients and causative factors, again, multifactorial conversation with autism, we could literally be here for dozens, if not hundreds of hours and talking about each of them individually. Because there is, I don't have a net number. There is a large number of factors at play, but I can make it simple for you by addressing 2 sets of 3. Okay, so can you tell I went to school for a long time and I had to force myself to learn through these different frameworks. And so now I teach through these frameworks of taking complex conversations and bringing them to simplicity, often using 3 steps, 5 steps, those sort of things. So there's 2 sets of 3 that I need you to be aware of with autism. Number 1, on a large 30,000 foot scale, what we see again and again is that children with autism went through all 3, or at least 1 or 2 of them significantly, of the 3 T's. So they were exposed to physical, chemical, and emotional stress, traumas, toxins, and thoughts. And again, the important disclaimer, or kind of asterisk here, is if they were exposed to these 3 types of stress early and often, so in utero, at birth, and in the first 1, 2, 3 years of life, that's a sure sign. Too much of the 3 T's overwhelms a child's ability to adapt and be resilient to stress. Now, God designed us to handle toxins. God designed our kids to handle a virus. God designed our kids to develop. But if that stress is too much too early, it overwhelms what's called their adaptive capacity or their resiliency, and it shifts their nervous system into fight or flight sympathetic mode, which we're about to break down for the back half of this episode. So that's the first set of 3 we'll always talk about with autism. The 3 T's are the 3 different types of toxins and stressors: physical, chemical, and emotional. Now, breaking down the specific perfect storm sequence, taking thousands of case histories as I have, I can tell you these 3 ingredients cause the most trouble. Now, I can say that with absolute certainty and conviction on this podcast because practice-based evidence, meaning all research, whether it's a big old fancy randomized clinical trial, gold standard meta-analysis, and you got to say it like that because these are like the research studies that people in white coats, they just love these, okay? They spend billions of dollars doing these studies for autism, by the way, and still haven't found much answers that they are talking about anyways. And so when you look at that, none of those are ever started until something is observed clinically. So research comes from doctors finding theories, coming up with concepts, if you will, scientific assumptions and theories. It's literally called the scientific method. All of us learned it in like 6th grade science class. You took a test on it one time and you observe something, you propose a theory, and then you test it out. That's what I've done with autism, and that's what has been done and is being done at a more rapid, better rate than ever before with the perfect storm 3 primary triggers. What are called fertility and prenatal distress. So some of the research will call this maternal distress. That's ingredient number 1. So a high risk, high stress, high pressure, high anxiety, high fear, high mom stuck in sympathetic fight or flight neurology herself, pregnancy and fertility journey. I'll break each of these down in detail here in a second. I want to list them and then we'll break them down. So the number 1 most common perfect storm ingredient we continue to see in practice in about 60, 70, 80% of our cases is what would be categorized as prenatal or maternal distress. Now, the research shows that as well. Second, what's called birth trauma. Now, the other word for birth trauma is birth intervention or birth augmentation. Sometimes you actually have to run that word through the PubMed and the search engines to find the research and the science that shows what I've seen 85 to 90% or more of kids I've seen in practice with autism. And that is thousands of cases. And I've now taught thousands of chiropractors to look for these clinical correlations, causative triggers and factors. And they've found these exact correlations as well. And once again, this is not just a practice-based observation conversation, which, by the way, if it was just that, there's insane value to that because that's where we get ahead of science is in practice actually taking care of kids. So I'm not meaning to limit that part of this conversation. I'm adding on to it with research and science that proves this perfect storm theory. Many of these papers have come out in the last couple of years. I first put together the perfect storm first ever PowerPoint presentation 15 years ago, and research is just now continuing to come to light to prove these scientific concepts. But the second one is birth trauma. Birth trauma to the vagus nerve, brain stem, and central nervous system. So the upper neck is the intersection between the brain and the spinal cord, the sensory nerves, the spinal nerves, the peripheral nervous system, and everything. The function of the nervous system is to perceive the environment and coordinate, meaning control and modulate, all other tissues, cells, and organs in the body. Now, that nervous system relies on clean, perfect, efficient communication and neurological signaling between the brain and between the body. That intersection is the brainstem. By far and away, the most important part of the nervous system is the upper neck and brainstem. That's obviously why head trauma, neck trauma, whiplash, these things are such big challenges. So the real life example I can give you to bring this to life is you're watching football and there's a big neck or head injury. That's where we worry about the worst of neurological outcomes for that person. Well, what if we're taking a big set of hands, a big pliers called forceps, and big plunger called vacuum extraction, and yanking and twisting and pulling millions of kids out into this world by their head and neck? When did that become okay? And why would we expect to put that much physical twisting, yanking, pulling onto the most delicate neurological tissue of a child who, by the way, doesn't even have head and neck control, musculature, neuromuscular activity at all yet, because they haven't come out here and dealt with gravity? If we physically, traumatically injure that, we expect their outcomes neurologically to be okay. Birth trauma, birth intervention is the single biggest missing link by far. It's not even close. It's a bigger deal than the microbiome. It's a bigger deal than gross motor function. It's a bigger deal than genetics. It's a bigger deal than all those other things, especially gross motor, microbiome, endocrine, adrenal function, because the nervous system controls all of those. The tone and the function of the central and autonomic nervous system, which is regulated air traffic control in the brainstem and the upper neck, sets the tone of the muscles, controls the coordination of the body, controls the function of the gut and the microbiome and the immune system. Everything from this conversation forward can be linked to the brainstem, the autonomic or central nervous system, and the vagus nerve. So birth trauma is the biggest deal. We've seen it in about 85 to 90% of our kids with autism clinically, and now the research shows that as well. And the third ingredient in this list of 3 on this first deep dive episode into autism is the early use and exposure to antibiotics, toxins, and other medications. And there's a sequence to even just these 3. If you're still with me on this, it's actually really simple. That is also a chronological list of the child's life. So that maternal distress, I told you I'll break them down. There is deep dive episodes coming up. In fact, actually the birth trauma one, because we feel that is the biggest conversation we need to have with you through the PX Docs platform, because we're well aware that you've gone deep into toxins and microbiome and gut health and gut brain. We know that you've got motor care, motor tone coordination, PT, OT, these sort of things. We know that you've worked on cleaning up your environment. But if a child suffered a physically traumatic birth, forceps, vacuum, C-section, emergency C-section, induction, and it created what's called subluxation and dysautonomia, which I'll break down next, that needs to be found and that needs to be fixed. Now, that is a word I use in my Iowa farmer mentality, meaning it needs to be adjusted. It needs to be handled as a neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor in a very specific, gentle, and effective way before gut healing can happen in full, before brain healing can happen in full, before development can get back on track. But this third ingredient of antibiotics and toxins, we're going to do deep dive episodes on maternal distress. Not just am I going to do a solo episode like this with the research and the science and making sense of it for you. We're going to interview expert after expert. We've got Dr. Allie Wright already lined up. We're going to talk about preconception and fertility in a deep dive way and then get into pregnancy. We got Dr. Lindsay Matthews-Cantu from the Birth Fit World lined up. We're going to talk about that journey to motherhood. We're going to talk about pregnancy, labor, delivery, postpartum. We're going to deep dive these conversations even more than I will right here. But let's address number 1 in the most simple of ways I can teach it to you in a way that no one else has. That umbilical cord during pregnancy. So the paper I'm looking in front of me. So the last couple of things are going to be sciencey, but I don't want to just read an academic nerdy paper and not bringing it to real life for you. But it says a review of the vagus nerve and autonomic nervous system during fetal development, searching for critical windows. This is the most perfect storm paper I've ever read. And we've got hundreds of papers that we reference with our work scientifically to put it all together. But this is the most complete. It does not explain it this way in this paper. It gets to a lot nerdier words here in a second, but here's what's happening with pregnancy and stress on mom's nervous systems and the clinical correlation to autism. That umbilical cord. When we think of the umbilical cord in today's world, we traditionally think of the umbilical cord as the pathway through with which oxygen, blood flow, which then delivers nutrients and nourishment to the growing and developing baby get in. And that's absolutely the story. We do not want, and we're well aware of the fact that if we put toxins like alcohol and cigarettes, obviously the most common that you're not supposed to have during pregnancy, if we put toxins, the middle T of the 3 T's, into the umbilical cord and into mom's bloodstream diet, and it gets into baby, my goodness, do we have negative outcomes when it comes to their neurophysiological health and development. That is known, that is proven, that's not complicated, that's not controversial, that's black and white physiological, right? The umbilical cord is also the power cord. It is the electrical cord that connects mom's nervous system. So using the electrical cord analogy here, The nervous system is each of our electrical systems. So just like in your house, there's this full neurological electrical supply to the house. And if it's like the main connection from brain to body, kind of jumping ahead in my analogy to all the pieces and parts, all the different fuses, if the main power goes out, if that main intersection, which would be the brainstem in this analogy, is interfered with, well, now we're dealing with multi-system, multi-fuse problems. We refer to this as the neuro-fuse box analogy of how the neurospinal, so the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord are really, really function and how they're designed. That's why a chiropractor, neurologically focused chiropractor, can have this conversation. Because if we physically injure, misalign, and damage the upper neck, the cranial system, and the neurospinal system, we immediately and often significantly alter neurological function. But it can actually and does first show up through this third T, emotional stress. In today's world, we have medicalized the ever-living heck out of pregnancy and labor and delivery. God forbid you got pregnant after the age of 35. We were going to do one ultrasound around 20 weeks, but now we're going to do 25 ultrasounds. Actually, forget that. We developed a special Android phone, and this would be an Android move, not an iPhone move. We're going to strap it to your belly, and it's 5D, 24/7, 365, just stress after stress. Now, I'm being facetious with this because it's the best way I know how to have a deep, pretty heavy conversation, but because we have disempowered moms to such a large degree, and we're totally okay with all of us, especially moms, being overscheduled, overburdened, and stressed to the max, more anxiety, more depression, more neurological stress on mom than ever before, mom's nervous system sets the tone for baby's nervous system, because mom's nervous system controls through the umbilical cord, the power cord, the tone or the setting and the wiring, if you will, of baby's nervous system. So if all mom knows during the fertility and the pregnancy journey is lots of stress, lots of tension, lots of anxiety, lots of exhaustion, that stress, that maternal distress, it's called in the literature, is shared with baby. Now, before I go a little bit deeper into birth trauma and the antibiotics and the toxins, let me just read the initial couple of sentences from this paper here, which is, we'll link it in the show notes. It's pretty heady. It's not something every parent necessarily would need to or want to learn, but man, does it tell the whole story scientifically here. So I read a little bit, and then I promise I'll bring it to real life. It says the autonomic nervous system is one of the main biological systems that regulates the body's physiology. Now, each sentence I read, I'm going to give you some extra context. It's not one of, it is the main biological system that regulates all of the body's physiology. Several studies have shown how the vagus nerve, which is what's called the parasympathetic rest, digest, regulation. So the vagus nerve, I haven't introduced this yet, but the reason it's so important into this birth trauma conversation is the vagus nerve branches from the brainstem. It is a cranial nerve that leaves the cranial vault and the brainstem, and it's called the wandering nerve. So it actually goes I know we're listening on podcasts as I draw this out on my neck, but maybe you're watching this on YouTube. And it goes all the way down through the neck, through the abdomen, and through the thorax. And it's in charge of rest, digest, regulation. We now know it's also in charge of socialization, emotional and behavioral regulation, speech and communication, and the anti-inflammatory effect as well, which they speak to here next. So it says several studies have shown how the vagus nerve is involved in many vital processes during fetal, perinatal, and postnatal life. From the regulation of inflammation, which is what a lot of people want to blame autism on, through the anti-inflammatory cholinergic pathway, which may affect the functioning of each organ, to the production of hormones involved in bioenergetic metabolism. Now, I told you there'd be some nerdy words. All they're doing is they're getting a little bit more detailed about how important the vagus nerve is in keeping inflammation down and keeping organ systems functioning. Where does every child with autism, pretty much to the T, struggles massively with gut health and immune inflammatory cascades. They are constantly constipated, constantly bloated, and constantly inflamed. And what I find clinically is that this still happens today even after parents have gone gluten-free, casein-free, and no longer put, environmental and food allergens and toxins into their child's body. And this is, and I know we're deep into the podcast episode already here, but this is one of those aha moments. This is one of those the second takeaway is really, I know you've been addressing inflammation, the microbiome, and the gut immune triad with your child with autism. And if you have done everything you thought possible in the anti-inflammatory GAPS diet, keto, you name it, to take inflammation down, you're loading them up on anti-inflammatory supplementation and essential oil, and you still can't stop their gut and their inflammatory cascade from running rampant, the vagus nerve is the answer. We need to activate the vagus nerve to then activate these pathways they're talking about in this paper to regulate inflammation. And if your child's nervous system was stressed and out of balance, what's called sympathetic dominant, subluxated from in utero fetal development on, it's not just that this function is malfunctioning, it's that it never developed. What we now know, the deepest interpretation of this perfect storm scientific theory, is that vagus nerve dysfunction isn't just from a damaged vagus nerve. For many kids with autism, it's a massively underdeveloped autonomic vagus nerve system. Now that's deep, that's nerdy, but when we get done, I'm going to show you how to get it back on track. Okay, we're going to talk about that. So in addition, the vagus nerve has been recognized as the primary afferent, meaning sensory incoming pathway, capable of transmitting information to the brain from every organ of the body. Just can't miss those words, every organ. If you've been trying to heal the multifactorial, multi-system challenge you know your child is dealing with autism, you got to get to the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system to get it done. Therefore, this hypothesis paper aims to review the development of the autonomic nervous system during fetal and perinatal life, focusing primarily on the vagus nerve. They use a measurement that we use clinically called HRV, heart rate variability, to identify possible critical windows that could impact its maturation, its development. These critical windows could help clinicians know when to monitor fetuses to effectively assess the developmental status of both the autonomic nervous system and specifically the vagus nerve. Now, when I say I love this paper because they're not just having this conversation in terms of healing, restoring, reversing chronic neurological conditions like autism. They're actually getting into the prevention and early detection conversation, if you will, which is what we use through what's called prenatal HRV. So we monitor our pregnant mom's health, not just by their symptoms and not just by their lab work, but we actually run a stress test for their nervous system called HRV, which is exactly what this paper did to study all this. And we can see stress brewing early for mom and baby. Now, if we see stress brewing early, like we introduced this episode, it's not about the awareness, it's about the action. Now we can make adjustments, neurologically regulating adjustments to mom, which in a pregnancy, in utero world, means we're adjusting that baby's nervous system at the same time. So as we go on here, last parts of this, in addition, this paper will focus on which factors, i.e. fetal characteristics and behaviors, maternal lifestyle and pathologies, placental health and dysfunction, labor, incubator conditions, and drug exposure. So they get into labor and delivery, and they get into antibiotics, and those exposures to toxins may have an impact on the development of the vagus during the above-mentioned critical window, and how. Last sentence, improving the management and health of newborns, particularly to reduce the potential adverse environmental impacts on autonomic nervous system and vagus nerve development that may lead to persistent long-term consequences. So this paper and many like it have proven that maternal distress, birth interventions, and early exposure to antibiotics, Prevacid, Prilosec, Miralax, and other forms of toxins, either ingested, injected, or inhaled, can overwhelm a child's autonomic nervous system during these critical, sensitive periods of development. So on this first time on the podcast that we do a deep dive into autism, I want to let you know this in closing. The neurological consequences of this. So the 3 T's, the 3 types of stress, Maternal distress would qualify as the emotional neurological stress that gets into a child's nervous system early during those fetal developmental periods. The physical stress from the second factor is the birth trauma and birth interventions to the brainstem, to the vagus nerve, to the autonomic air traffic control. So now that's going to shift the nervous system further into fight or flight mode and alter development. And then the third one, just in case the emotional stress and the physical stress during these early critical sensitive periods didn't already overwhelm a child's nervous system and throw them off track and on track to autism and other neurosensory neurodevelopmental conditions, now our kids are exposed to antibiotics, medications, and toxins at an earlier, oftener level than ever before. But if you're picking up what I'm putting down here, for so many of your kiddos with autism, yes, things got apparently very easily, recognizably worse after a toxic exposure. Yes, your child reacts severely negatively to gluten and casein and exposure to toxins. So are toxins the story for your child and the root cause of their autism? Yes, but that's an incomplete story in the vast majority of cases. In the vast majority of these cases, there was actually stress stuck on the child's nervous system before the environmental toxins could even show up and wreak their havoc. So to fully, foundationally get your child to heal with autism, to go to the root of their development and the real deep root cause of their condition, you've got to get into the autonomic and central nervous system. Because the last thing I have to teach you on this episode, and I'll rapid fire it because we teach it a lot on other episodes, is when a child is exposed to these three stressors, these three T's in the perfect storm early during these sensitive periods, the nervous system, I've got one more list of three, and it's the third take-home point. This is what happens to the nervous system. Number one, it's the thing we've alluded to the whole time. The nervous system, when exposed to stress of all three kinds, shifts into sympathetic dominance. It gets into sympathetic fight or flight overdrive. That gas pedal fight or flight system that God gave our kids, it's designed to turn on in a protective emergency response and then turn back off. Babies, developing brains especially, are supposed to eat, sleep, poop, and then move. Go through motor, gross motor development, and then fine motor, and then brain-based development from that. So the first thing that the perfect storm causes is the nervous system to get stuck in sympathetic fight or flight stress mode. There's a catch-all term for that chiropractically, which is not really a word, but it is now, called subluxation. When you hear us talk about subluxation on this podcast or on our website or anywhere else, subluxation means stress stuck on. The sympathetic fight or flight nervous system switched on and stuck on, which is the same thing as saying the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic rest, regulation, detoxification, anti-inflammatory, social, emotional, behavioral regulation, speech and communication branch and side of the nervous system is suppressed, shut down. And as this research and this conversation shows us, for many kiddos, it actually never developed, never turned on, and never got activated in the first place. So the first response to the perfect storm is what's called subluxation and dysautonomia, the nervous system getting out of balance and stuck in sympathetic fight or flight, parasympathetic shutdown. Now, the second component is what we call neurological confusion. When a child, and these are all in order, we talked about sequence the whole time, this is the last one. When the nervous system is subluxated, stuck in sympathetic dominance, it then gets off track developmentally. Dr. Bruce Lipton, one of the pioneers in epigenetics we talked about early in this podcast, is known to say you can't be in growth and protection at the same time. You can't be in fight or flight stress mode and growth and development mode at the same time. So once a child is subluxated and their nervous system is stuck in dysautonomia and sympathetic dominance, their whole development from gross motor development on the outside, so motor and muscles development, is thrown off track and delayed. And on the inside, their digestion, their their GI system, and their immune system, and their endocrine system and metabolic system, the development is altered and delayed. So the second neurological consequence is neurodevelopmental delays, which is obviously the path we're heading down the road to an autism diagnosis. And the third thing, that depending upon the age, the severity, and the duration, that your child has been stuck in this neurological sympathetic fight or flight perfect storm. The third neurological consequence of the perfect storm, which unfortunately we see clinically more today than ever before, is what we call neurological exhaustion. So these are kiddos who, no matter how many healing mechanisms, whether they're natural or not, you throw into your child's biological, physiological system, when the nervous system has gone through to this third stage of subluxation, as we call it, it goes off the sympathetic cliff and the nervous system is just flat out, worn out. This is where the adrenals shut down. This is where metabolism shuts down. The nervous system controls, as this paper and my conversation had with you today, the central and autonomic nervous system control everything. So when it's stuck in fight or flight, step one, and it's altered and out of balance and off development, step two, you better believe it messes with every organ and every system of the body. But when it reaches this third stage of neurological exhaustion and depletion, those are the kids that have chronic neural challenges. These are what we call intensive cases, where families just feel like, they're running out of hope, where it's like, we've literally tried everything medically. We've tried everything naturally. We've tried everything in the movement-based therapy world. And we've maybe seen some gains or maybe not. Maybe your kiddo is just continually stuck, plateaued, or worse, continues to regress. If that's the case for your child with autism, if you're seeing them completely stuck, completely plateaued, or continuing to regress into further challenges, it's likely that their nervous system has reached this third stage of subluxation and dysautonomia, where they are exhausted. Now, all of this, I promised you this. I said, you know what? We're going to have a long, what's it been, 10 minutes? I don't know, 15 minutes times 10 or 15 conversation about autism on this early episode of the Experience Miracles podcast. This is what started my journey into the perfect storm. It wasn't called the perfect storm until I studied and found the causes, multiple plural, of autism in a certain sequence, starting with stress on the nervous system and the vagus nerve, subluxation and dysautonomia. It was finding these answers, finding these causes, which immediately turns us into action. So the coolest thing about all of my conversations about autism or anything is it takes me 98 to 99% of the time to give you the neurophysiological scientific explanations that then set up the action. So here's the single most important, most potent is the word I choose to use, thing, or choose to describe the thing that's probably fully foundationally missing from getting your child to heal, and that is neurologically focused chiropractic adjustments. Now, this is not regular chiropractic. And again, most chiropractors, they work on musculoskeletal, back pain, neck pain, headache, accident, sports injuries. Awesome. A chiropractor taking care of those things without drugs is way better than opioids and surgery. Now, there's another branch of chiropractors, pediatric, general family wellness chiropractors. Those are chiropractors who have maybe helped you already with the conversation around, hey, we got to work on these toxins. We got to work on the probiotics. We got to work on the microbiome. We got to talk about primitive reflexes and accommodation. Those are all important things we just had the conversation on, but there's secondary elements to subluxation, sympathetic dominance, dysautonomia, and the perfect storm. So a PX doctor, which stands for the pediatric experience. PX, we want to change your child's experience, get them out of the storm to their fullest optimal outcomes and full potential. And that we just know clinically, we've seen it, scientifically, we've proven it. We just know that kids can't get to that full unlock of their fullest potential without adjusting the vagus nerve and the nervous system through neurologically focused chiropractic. The clinical protocols that we discovered, and again, here closing this out, kind of like I did in the beginning, I got to talk a little bit more personally maybe than I love to do. These are the clinical protocols that I first learned and put in play in practice. So taking a little bit of this training, a little bit of that training, a little bit of this training, and putting it all together to serve kids who are 17, 18, 19 with autism, Asperger's, epilepsy, whose families and parents were coming to me with a last resort mentality. They had tried everything medically, every medication, every therapy, every behavior, cognitive behavioral therapy, ABA, diet change, detox, you name it. And my early career was 17, 18, 20, 21-year-old kids with autism, Asperger's, and chronic neurological conditions. And I dug into their case history. I had mom and dad take me all the way back to fertility, pregnancy, labor, delivery, and whether or not they had antibiotics and exposures to toxins early in life. And in 95%, I had some or all of that add up and say, there it is. Your child's nervous system is stuck in fight or flight, out of balance, subluxated. Nobody's addressed that yet, which is why the healing and the progress has been limited. Now we get to do that for infants and young kids. And no matter where this episode found you, no matter what level, what severity, or what age your child has with autism, or hopefully you're listening to this and your child doesn't yet have a diagnosis, but maybe your mom gut says, we're heading in a direction I don't want to. And the pediatrician and everybody else just keeps dismissing me and saying, don't worry about it, they'll grow out of it. But you know the opposite is true. They're going to grow into more challenges. Neurologically, that's true. Science has proven it. Maybe you're listening to this and your child's sensory, ADHD, something else, but still this conversation helped with you. I need you to share this, but most importantly, those of you whose children are struggling with autism and you want to get them to their fullest outcome, need you to not only go to the website and read all the articles. I want you, all the terms we may be introduced to you for the first time, vagus nerve, subluxation, dysautonomia, birth trauma, maternal distress, you name it. And there's more nerdy ones on the website and more articles. Go there and read more and learn more if you need to. But my prayer, my plan is that this podcast episode right here got you to see the one singular action that is likely the foundational missing link that your family, your child needs. And that is to get a neurologically focused pediatric chiropractor on your care team. When you go to our website, which wherever we share these podcasts, the show notes will have it. But if you go to PXDocs, so PXDOCS.com, and you click on the tab and the button that is everywhere on there that says find a PX doc, put in your region, put in your zip code, put in your city, and call them, connect them. I just aged myself there by saying call them. This is a digital world. There's a form. You put in your name and email and they will contact you. You fill out a form and it goes to them and they come to you and they will do. On this episode, I had to do the full spread of the conversation deep dive into autism. What they will do is they will do a deep dive personal individual case history assessment like no doctor has ever done for your child individually. I know they'll do that and they'll do it well because I trained them to do it. Second, they'll run what are called the insight scans. So this whole nervous system dysfunction and imbalance we talked about, vagus nerve, HRV, we use that exact technology. We're one of the only providers, if not the only providers, not just within healthcare, but even within chiropractic, that actually can measure the dysfunction and the imbalance within your child's autonomic nervous system. We can measure it, we can quantify it, and we can locate it. And if you love technology and you love these sort of functional assessments for your child with autism, you can find an article all about the insight scans and our clinical process on the website as well. It's one of the main tabs right next to the Find a Doc tab. So if you still need more information before you connect with your PX doctor, it's on the website, pxdocs.com. You can read more articles about autism, about birth trauma, about the vagus nerve. You can read more information and watch more videos about our clinical process and this incredible technology we use to find for real the root cause of your child's challenges. And the moment you're ready, take action. Get connected with your trained and ready neurologically focused PX doctor. That's what this podcast is for. Information, awareness, education, resources, yes. Empowerment, engagement, community, connection, and action, heck yes. That's what God called us to this podcast to become that voice of hope, answers, and help for you. Stay tuned to more of these podcast episodes. We're going to interview expert after expert in the autism and the neurodevelopmental world. We're going to deep dive into maternal distress, preconception, fertility, HRV, everything we introduced today. We already have done a deep dive, so you can kind of scroll up on our podcast and listen to previous episodes if this is the first one you've found us through. And then stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe. You follow us on Instagram, Facebook. You go to our website, put in your name and email so you get our newsletter, because we will announce every podcast episode. Be sure to subscribe. We'd love a review. And we know that it's this information that first starts the action to get a child to heal and recover and get to the other side of their storm. I'm wearing my shirt this whole time that says "Into the Storm," and we go in it with you so we can get you through and to the other side of it. So please share the heck out of this podcast episode, especially if you're in any autism Facebook groups or communities. Share it with your professionals and your team that you trust to help take care of your kiddo. Share it excitingly. Hey, now if we add this, we expect more from this. That's exactly how it works. I'll wrap this one up now. We love you. We're so thankful for you for tuning in, for sharing, subscribing, and sending this on out to the world. We know that this is a generation of kids and families and parents that needs hope, answers, and drug-free help now more than ever, and we're committed to bringing it to you. God bless. Be well. See you on the next one.